starting. That's all we're going to go with then. Okay, we're continuing our look. We have two more this week and next week. Two more encounters with Jesus. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. This to me has been really interesting. It's been a neat way to look at these different settings. You learn a lot about Jesus, learn a lot about Jesus' character, but then you also can kind of cover the whole gamut of his life, which I think is kind of neat. So let me ask you this before we get started with tonight. Who's seen somebody famous? Who'd you see, Zach? Yes? John Travolta from the back room. Ooh, Ronald Reagan. That's pretty cool. Kara and I saw Les Miles at the airport once. We saw Mr. Peterman from Seinfeld at the airport. And then we think we saw Kevin Sorbo, which is a nobody actor, at Disneyland one time. So Kevin Sorbo? Yeah. See, he's a B-movie actor. Oh, yeah, he does a lot of the religious movies lately. You saw Shaquille? Wow. I bet that was humbling, huh? We have Kara's sister and her husband met Jermaine O'Neal. He used to play for the Pacers on their honeymoon. And Josh, my brother-in-law, he's a fairly big guy. He looks like an infant next to Jermaine O'Neal. What is it about seeing somebody famous that's cool? Yeah, you can raise your hand in class and go, I saw Ronald Reagan. But it is cool. I mean, yeah, exactly. You can tag stuff. But it's kind of cool because you have that thing where you can kind of go, you have that, I can name this name and everybody's going to know the name. And it's just neat that I've seen that person, all these different famous people. And it doesn't matter even if it's just kind of a local celebrity. I remember I think it was probably 2 years after the Boise State OU Fiesta Bowl. We were at a BSU basketball game, and we're there. It was one of Blake's friends' birthday parties, and literally across the arena, the boys spotted Ian Johnson, and I was like, "That's Ian Johnson, he's a football player." But then we kind of watched, and they were going to come, and they sat right in front of us, and I was like, "Oh, it's Ian Johnson." It was like, I don't know, he's just some guy, but it was cool. And even that, you kind of feel like you're 9 years old for some reason. In our encounter tonight, Jesus in a short time meets what people in his day would have thought of as a lot of famous people. Very well-known people. He meets some of these people back to back to back to back. We're going to focus primarily on one of them, and the huge difference in the good things about seeing famous people or getting to meet famous people. Jesus meets these people and none of it's good. It's all a mess. The night and the morning prior to his crucifixion, Jesus is ridiculously mistreated. Put through a ridiculous set of trials, if you will, shifted back and forth, and 8 times in almost the same phrasing, but some a little different phrasing, the Gospels use the phrase, they led him away. And it's over, they led him away to this, then they led him away to this person, then they led him away to this person. So tonight we're going to look at 4 or 5 of those really kind of just briefly, 3 or 4 of them, and then spend our time focusing on one particular encounter. One particular engagement with Jesus that goes on for quite a while. Before we get started, though, I asked Blake if he would to lead us in a prayer, so if you would, please.
For this time to be more together, we ask that our worship is pleasing to you. And last, God, we ask that you open our hearts and open our minds. Apply it readily to our lives. Go with us.
Amen. Okay, if you want to open your Bibles, you might want to do the multi-tab thing if you can. We're going to start with John chapter 18. but we're going to bounce around a lot between John and Luke and Matthew, and then we'll hit Mark a little bit. In John chapter 18, beginning at verse 12, this is right after the arrest in the garden, right after, the apostle, or, Peter drew a sword and cut off Malchus's ear, and Jesus is like, wait, what are you doing? That's not our plan. In chapter 18, verse 12, while he's being taken away, then the company of soldiers, the commander, and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus and tied him up. First, they led him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Caiaphas, here's John's kind of side note, Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be better for one man to die for the people. So as Jesus is arrested, his first celebrity, if you will, that he gets to meet is Annas, the high priest. And it's interesting that John uses this description. Caiaphas and Annas, the high priest. He was the high priest that year. How long was a high priest a high priest? For life. So there's, even in the way John describes that, there's some political stuff there that we won't necessarily go into. But he is questioned about his teaching in front of Annas. He is, in verse 22, Jesus is slapped by one of the people questioning. So, just immediately, there's so much going wrong. This is not how a trial is supposed to happen. Then in verse 24, it says, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So he goes from Annas on to Caiaphas. Now, in Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 26, what we find out is that with Caiaphas, there's a whole lot of people there. Chapter 26, verse 57 says, those who had arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had convened. So there's a big crowd there. Again, keep in mind, this is at night. This is not how this is supposed to be happening. But there's this crowd gathered together, so Caiaphas kind of puts on a show. Look at verse 65. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? See, now you've heard the blasphemy. What is your decision? They answered, he deserves death. Then they spat in his face and beat him. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Messiah. Who was it that hit you? So, not to delve too deeply in just what a horrible, terrible thing this is, Caiaphas, they're looking for false witnesses. They finally get some people to say the right things. And now they decide it's time that he deserves to be put to death. What's the problem? They can't do it. So they're like, yeah, he deserves to die. They spit on him. And then they're like, so now what? So the next step is in chapter 27. When daybreak came, 27 verse 1, all the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. After tying him up, they led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. And this is where I want us to kind of spend the rest of our time primarily, is with Jesus' exchange, this encounter with Pilate. A lot of times you'll see the expression used that this is where Jesus comes before Pilate. Jesus stands before Pilate. I think Pilate stands before Jesus in this. Because Pilate, Jesus knows what's going to happen. Jesus knows the results of his trial. Pilate's the one on trial here. And every time I read through the accounts with Pilate, I'm kind of torn about what do I feel bad for this guy? He's kind of caught. He's a man definitely in a dilemma, in a political bind. He probably has next to zero concern about these Jewish people, other than keeping the peace and collecting their taxes. As far as what they think, what they believe, he doesn't care. One of the great things, I guess you'd say great, and it was a great thing, about the Romans is that they had this plan that wherever we go conquer and take over and rule, we'll let them keep their religious practices. We'll let them keep their stuff because that keeps them happy. So they'll be happy, but they're still paying his taxes and we're still in charge. So chances are he probably doesn't really care about any of this whole religious intrigue. However, history, extra biblical history, does tell us a whole lot about Pilate that helps me decide I really don't feel sorry for this guy at all. Matthew, in his account, calls him governor. His actual title was prefect. I mean, he was the prefect over this region. He's the 5th prefect of Judea. Seems like he may have served as prefect for about a decade, about a 10-year period from maybe 26 or 7 to 36 or 7, appointed by Tiberius Caesar himself, which is kind of interesting. Pilate served in the military, served in Germany, in part of that whole Roman Germanic wars and all that stuff. He was probably an middle to upper middle class property owner in the military. When he was stationed in Rome, history kind of hints and legends intertwine that he met this young lady named Claudia. But her name is Claudia Procula. She was the granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. So that seems like maybe why this guy who really was this position of being put as prefect of Judea was really above what he should have been. I mean, that was kind of above his pay grade, if you will. But he got this job, got this position. Side note, this was a terrible position. Nobody wanted this position because, really big shock to everybody, that area, that part of the world was in turmoil. So much has changed. But he got this job as prefect over Judea, and he got to take his wife, which was unusual. But because she's Caesar Augustus' granddaughter, there's some political connections there. But again, his job, collect taxes, keep the peace. I don't really care about what these people are doing. Just stay out of my life. Now, like I said, Palestine is a place of some unrest. Now, what's also weird is historically there are some different views about Pilate. I found this very interesting. The Ethiopian Coptic Church recognized both Pontius Pilate and his wife Procula as saints and observed June 25th in their honor. And man, everything I read about this guy is he's kind of a weasel. But I mean, Church Father Tertullian says that Pilate was, a quote, a Christian in his conscience. Whatever that means. But other historians, Philo writes about his venality, his violence, his thefts, his assaults, his abusive behavior, his frequent executions of untried prisoners, and his endless savage ferocity. That goes with more of the stories and more of the history that you hear or that you read about Pilate. He had this thing about he wanted to move these shields that were gold shields engraved with Greek or Roman gods. He wanted to move those into Herod's temple. And the people had a big fit about that, of course. It was like, we don't want idol images in the temple, even in Jerusalem. And even some of his family said, don't do that. That's just going to cause problems. It's going to make these people mad. He fought that over and over. He also decided at one point that Jerusalem needed a new aqueduct, needed a new water supply. So he just went in and took money from the temple treasury and decided this is the money we're going to use to fund this aqueduct. Well, the people kind of rallied around the temple and kind of started a little protest. So he had soldiers dressed like the regular people and go intermingle among the people and kind of blend in. And then they pulled out clubs and just started beating the people. And beat some people literally to death. And that was just kind of his MO. That's how he dealt with these people. We know from Luke chapter 13, verse 1, that he killed some Galileans while they were sacrificing. Now, Galileans had a bad reputation, so there might be more to the story. That's all we know, is that he mixed their blood with the blood of the sacrifices. But what that does tell us is he had no problem killing people in places that, you would think that might not be the place to kill somebody. But because of all this, his approach added to the unrest. Added to the whole tension of the area. I think I mentioned when we talked about Lazarus, that it really, to me, it helps to understand the last few months of Jesus' life, if you can understand the political tension that's there, the beyond the religious tension. I mean, Rome's there. You got, even in this situation, we're going to bring in Herod. So there's another political dynamic to it. But because of all this, because of the way he treats all these people and the way he handles this, he's recalled by Tiberius Caesar back to Rome in 37 AD. Now, there's all kinds of stuff about what happened to him, that he was banished to Gaul, and that there's some stories that he killed himself. There's some legend that says that he became a chronic habitual hand washer because of what we know about what he does here. We'll get to in a minute. But all kinds of stories. But he basically just kind of disappears. But that all being said, the tension, partly because of what he'd created, was palpable at the time of Jesus's goofy trials, all this stuff that's going on. Pilate doesn't live necessarily in Jerusalem. He lives probably in Caesarea, but he's there because it's the time of the Passover. Pilate's in Jerusalem. Herod is in Jerusalem. Herod's in Jerusalem just to show off. I mean, Herod's just there because a bunch of Jewish people are going to be there. Jesus and the apostles are there. Thousands of Jewish pilgrims are there to come to celebrate the Passover. So the scene is ripe. I mean, the scene is tense. The scene is set for all of what's about to happen. And we have to kind of assume, in fact, I think, Richard, you may have preached about this here a while back, talking about, you have to assume that Pilate knew something about Jesus. I mean, he's in charge. I don't know that he cared that much about the religious part of the Jews and this guy who claims to be their new ruler or whatever. But he's got to know, he's got to have a pulse of the city. He's got to know, okay, there's this guy that's kind of causing a problem. It's like everywhere he goes, there's this that goes everywhere with him. So we got to keep an eye on this guy. So all that to say that once they go through, once the Jewish leaders go as far as they can go with their mock trials, their illegal trial, they know they've got to go to Pilate. So they take Jesus to the Praetorium, the judgment hall. In Luke chapter 23, if you want to turn over to Luke chapter 23, we'll look at what it says in Luke's account. But first, I just want to read to you what John says in John 18, verses 28 and 29. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the Praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter into the Praetorium. Why? So they wouldn't be defiled. What? Yeah, that was Gentile area. We don't go in there. We're not going to go in there because we'd be defiled. Never mind the fact that we've broken 100 different laws already. Never mind the fact that we're about to get a guy killed who we know has done nothing wrong. We just hate him. But we're not going to go in there because we don't want to be defiled. They don't want to be defiled. Therefore, Pilate went out to meet them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" So Pilate at least says, okay, what's the deal with this guy? What is it that you're so upset about? Now, what was their response? You didn't turn to John 18, so I'll tell you. Verse 30, they answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." What's that answer? Yeah. Well, of course he's a bad guy. We brought him here, didn't we? Yeah, it's like, yeah, of course he's just bad. Can we kill him? I mean, that's almost what it seems like. Why are they dodging this? What are they supposed to say? Well, they've got nothing to prove, for one thing. What are they going to say? Yeah, he claims he's the Messiah. What's Pilate going to say? So what? I don't even know what that means. But, I mean, they accuse him of blasphemy. Pilate's going to say, blaspheming what? Has he broken any laws? That's what I want to know. Oh, yeah, I think God had a hand in all of it. I mean, in fact, it's interesting you say that. As we move through here, there's another thing, another instance that we're all familiar with, but When we get there, I think that's important to kind of look at. So he finally does say, okay, I've got to get involved with this somehow. They're not going to take this guy away. So he asks one question. He asks in Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 2, they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation, opposing payment of taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king. So they're at this point, they're going, well, he did say we shouldn't pay taxes. When did Jesus say that? What chapter is that in? It's not. I mean, Jesus flat out said the opposite. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So they're just making this up. And that he himself is the Messiah, a king. So they're kind of dropping the hint. He's saying, he's using the K word here. So Pilate said, are you the king of the Jews? He answered, you say so. Larry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we were ready for a battle. Yeah, what Larry's saying is you gotta remember it's just a few days before this when Jesus comes into Jerusalem and the people are throwing palm fronds and taking off their coats and yelling what? Hosanna. Now, they're saying save us now. And so all the Romans have got to be going, okay, that must be the guy. That's the guy we got to worry about. So like I said, the tension is there. So back in John 18, like I said, we're going to bounce around some here. Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? So Jesus wants to explain to him what his kingdom is. He says, yeah, I am, but not like you're thinking. In John 18, verse 34, Jesus says, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Pilate answered, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, just like you were saying. My servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king. Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Okay, which, Jesus basically just says, yeah, I'm a king, but I'm not threatening your kingdom. I'm a king of a different sort. And it's, of course, this point that leads to Pilate's great question, what is truth? Now, as I've looked at this stuff for the last few days, people are all over the map about what Pilate is saying here. Is he being sarcastic? Is he being philosophical, because that's kind of a Roman thing? Is he basically just saying, listen to what Jesus says, saying, oh, you're the kingdom of truth? What's truth? Like, look around. Look at look at this city where there's so much different diversity that says it's all truth. Whatever he's saying, what he doesn't attempt to do is get the truth from Jesus. Richard. Oh, yeah. Yeah, in fact, in the next verse, or still in verse 38 in John 18, same thing in Luke chapter 23, Pilate says, what is truth? And he went out and said this. He went out to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. He says that 5 times in John's gospel, in variations, over 8 times in all the gospels, recorded in different ways. Pilate over and over says, this guy's not guilty of anything. How many times should he have had to say that? Once. I saw a quote from some historian that said that when Pilate sat on, was that seat is called? Is it literally called the judgment seat in the temple? Yeah, but it's literally called that when Herod was sitting in that judgment. So Richard showed a slide of that a few Sunday nights ago. That it's literally a seat. But this historian said that when Pilate sat in that seat, he was Rome. So he had the absolute authority of Rome. So one time, that's all he had to say. I find no guilt in this guy. Go home. But again, it's like God, this was God doing this. I mean, yes, it's the Jews and it's all this other stuff, but Pilate should have just went, done, go home. This is ridiculous. Nolan. Exactly. Excellent segue. Nice work. In Luke chapter 23, exactly what Nolan says. At this point, Pilate is going, he says, I find no guilt, and he says it's over and over. We'll see that in a minute. At this point, he's going, I got to think of something. I don't know what to do with this guy. In Luke chapter 23, in verse 4, Pilate then told the chief priests and the crowds, I find no grounds for charging this man. But they kept insisting. He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he started, even to here. And Pilate goes, wait, say that again? And they said, yeah, he does. He's stirring up trouble from Judea, or from Galilee, where he started, even to here. When Pilate heard this, verse 6, he asked if the man was a Galilean. So he says, bing, there's my out. He's a Galilean. It keeps going. Finding that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem during those days. He sees this as his way out. And like I said, Herod's in town too. He says, send him over to Herod. This is Herod Antipas. This is the son of Herod the Great, Herod the First. Herod the First was the Herod, the king. Herod's a title. He was the Herod when Jesus was born, the decree to kill all the babies. That's this guy's dad. And you look for Bible characters, you Google them, you try and find these pictures. I'm pretty sure that's not a Polaroid of what Herod. But I thought that was that seemed like the best picture because that guy just looks like a weasel. But this is the guy who once dad steps aside or dies, he dies. This is the guy who steals his half-brother, Herod Philip the First, who is a Herod in another region, stole his wife, Herodias, and that's the guy. This is the guy that John the Baptist says, why do you have your brother's wife? And he's like, shut up. I mean, he's saying, you're married to somebody you're not supposed to be married to. So what does he do? He has John the Baptist killed. So this guy is charming, obviously. Look at Luke 23, verse 8. This is how he deals with Jesus. Herod was very glad to see Jesus. For a long time, he had wanted to see him because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some miracle performed by him. So Herod sees Jesus as entertainment. He's like, let's have this guy. He does some sort of magic show. Bring him in. Let's see what he does. So he kept asking him questions, but Jesus did not answer him. So off to the side, the chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt, mocked him, dressed him in bright clothing, and sent him back to Pilate. And this verse, this has always astounded me. That very day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Previously, they had been enemies. So Pilate sends him to Herod, thinking maybe Herod will make some sort of decision. Herod treats him like a plaything and treats him even worse than Pilate had treated him in a lot of ways, dresses him up in kingly clothing, and sends him back to Pilate just to show these Jewish leaders that here's what I think of the guy that thinks he's your king. Get him out of here. From Jesus' perspective, it's so disrespectful. We talk a lot about the scourging and the nails, and just the way Jesus was treated. Just, I mean, as a human, it's terrible. And again, these are the rulers of the time. But now we go back to Matthew chapter 27. So Jesus goes back to Pilate. Matthew chapter 27, you get at least a glimpse of Pilate's perception of Jesus in this. Chapter 27, verse 13. Then Pilate said to him, "Don't you hear how much they're testifying against you?" But he didn't answer him on even one charge, so that the governor was quite amazed. You think of the prophecies about Jesus. You think of Isaiah 53 about like a lamb that's led before the slaughter, doesn't make a noise, doesn't protest at anything. What would you think if you're Pilate? You've got this guy that, I mean, these people are just angry, wanting him killed with no evidence. And he's going, "What do you have to say about this?" And he doesn't answer. What would you think if you were Pilate? Maybe. He must not have any sort of defense, so he's just going to sit there and be quiet. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, what Steve said is that he did respond to, and it almost seems like when it's just him and Pilate, he responds, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus goes, "Yeah, I am. Here's what my kingdom is." But then after he's gone through this mess with Herod and come back, to me it looks like Jesus just goes, "Enough. This is pointless." Wendell and Dana. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I said, the whole, what Wendell's saying, the whole fact that Jesus doesn't defend himself, Pilate's got to be going, "What do I do now? I mean, I don't see any guilt in this guy, but these people sure seem to think he's guilty of something, but they can't even say what it is." Yeah. Yeah, what Dana said, that you got to think that from like a legal perspective, Pilate would be thinking, say something. If you say something, maybe we can get you out of this, or maybe you can hang yourself. But with him without him saying anything, to me it looks like Jesus just going, "Enough." Yep. We'll get to her. Darla mentions cheats and jumps ahead, and mentions Pilate's wife. We'll get to the wife in just a minute. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, what April's saying is this is a guy who's killed people his whole life, and now he's trying to get somebody out of being. This is a weird situation for Pilate all the way around. Okay, but then he gets this one last idea. So he's saying, "Okay, went to Herod. That was a joke. That was a mistake. Should have never done that." Then he remembers, we have this law that on the night of or the time of this feast, I can release one prisoner to you. But he also knows, I have to give you a choice. I can't just go, "So I'm picking this guy," because the people have to choose. So he says, "Take this guy, or take, the child of Ayatollah Khomeini and Osama bin Laden," is basically what it amounts to. He says, "Or take Barabbas, who is a terrorist, an insurrectionist, just sounds like a bad guy." And Pilate goes, "Take this Jesus, who we really can't pinpoint really anything that you guys are really mad about, or this horrible person." He says, "This man or Barabbas." I mean, and he gives them the choice. And it seems like this is where he goes, you know, if this doesn't work, I don't know what else to do. And like I said, to me, I've always kind of read that he picked the worst person in the people in the streets should feel safer with Barabbas in prison. And he goes, I'll let this guy loose, or this Jesus guy who, you know, isn't really doing anything. And we know what the people choose. Oh, yeah. 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 Yeah, what Nathan was saying is the first part is, even in Acts, they reference the fact that, you know, Pilate tried to let this guy go, and you people there at Pentecost, you're the ones who wanted him to die. But then he also said that you think about Jesus' silence here, it might be that moment, kind of a reflection of that moment in the garden where he says, not my will, but yours be done. I'm not going to fight this. This is your will. I could scream and holler and fight with it. I could, you know, could do the 10,000 angels thing, but this is your plan. Larry. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. What Larry just summarized is that Pilate has all the evidence in front. It has all the lack of evidence, and Jesus himself not saying anything. And Pilate could have made a ruling and didn't. This is the interlude here. This to me is bizarre. I've always thought this is strange. Oh yeah, he made the same ruling about 11 times. Yeah, yeah, and that's exact, and that's the point. He did make a ruling. He just didn't carry through. Yeah, but there's this thing, and like I said, we don't have enough time to talk about this. In Matthew 27:19, one verse, Pilate's wife comes to him. He's asked, who do you want, Jesus or Barabbas? And it seems like there's a lull here where the people are milling around. And she comes to him, and it says she sent word to him. But she said, don't have anything to do with this guy. As I had a bad dream about this whole thing last night. And I've always thought, and like I said, this is speculation and everything, but how does she even know anything about Jesus? I mean, maybe it's just in her position as his wife. Maybe Jesus has made that much of an impact that she's even heard that this guy is somebody we don't want to mess with. And again, like Larry said a while ago, it's been almost a week now where Jesus has been in town. There was the Hosanna thing. There's Jesus in the temple, and there's all this commotion. But for some reason, she's like, she feels strongly enough to go to her husband and say, don't do this. So at this point, Pilate is just like, what am I supposed to do here? And just to get through this, he knows Jesus is innocent, and he asks this question: what shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the King of the Jews? It seems very, very clear he doesn't want to do this. Look at these. I find no guilt. I found no guilt in this man. In him I found no guilt. I find no guilt in him. I find no guilt in him. This should have stopped. This should have all been over. But here's the problem with the whole situation. In John chapter 19, you read the first 12 verses there, the whole situation. But the Jewish leaders throw out this phrase: if you don't do this, you're no friend of Caesar. Who appointed him? This guy, Tiberius Caesar. Suetonius records the rumors of lurid tales of perversity, including graphic depictions of violence and cruelty, and most of all, his paranoia. In that phrase, they're saying, think of who gave you this job. If he finds out that there's a guy that said he's the king and you didn't do something about it, you know how nuts he is. He'll come for you. So he decides, okay, and he does the hand washing thing, washes his hands of it. I'm not going to just rush through this. We'll finish this next week, because what happens after this will lead into our final encounter. But there's some lessons we need to take away from this beyond what we've already talked about, and I don't want to just leave it hanging here. But read that John chapter 19, the first 12 verses. Read this whole hand-washing thing. And then next Wednesday night we'll kind of talk about what can we take from what we see from Pilate that we can make work in our lives. Any thoughts here? Okay. I knew I had more than we could get through, but like I said, we'll pick this up next week, and then we'll finish out with our final encounters next week.